He began to swim towards her, quietly, cutting through the water with no fuss. He had almost reached the bank when she looked up and saw him. His feet touched the muddy riverbed. As he rose from the dark river and walked up the stone steps, she saw that the world they stood in was his, that he belonged to it, that it belonged to him. The water, the mud, the trees, the fish, the stars. He moved so easily through it. As she watched him, she understood the quality of his beauty, how his labor had shaped him, how the wood he fashioned had fashioned him. Each plank he planed, each nail he drove, each thing he made had molded him, had given him his strength, his supple grace. He wore a thin white cloth around his loins, looped between his dark legs. He shook the water from his hair. She could see his smile in the dark, his white, sudden smile that he had carried with him from boyhood into manhood, his only luggage. They looked at each other. They weren't thinking any more. The time for that had come and gone. Smashed smiles lay ahead of them, but that would be later. She went to him and laid the length of her body against his. He just stood there. He didn't touch her. He was shivering, partly with cold, partly terror, partly aching desire. Despite his fear, his body was prepared to take the bait. It wanted her. Urgently. His wetness wet her. She put her arms around him. He tried to be rational. What's the worst thing that can happen? She could hear the wild hammering of his heart. She held him till it calmed down somewhat. She unbuttoned her shirt. They stood there, skin to skin. Her brownness against his blackness, her softness against his hardness, her nut brown breasts against his smooth ebony chest. She smelled the river on him. Ammo put out her tongue and tasted it in the hollow of his throat, on the lobe of his ear. She pulled his head down towards her and kissed his mouth. A cloudy kiss, a kiss that demanded a kiss back. He kissed her back, first cautiously, then urgently. She could feel the skin on his palms, rough, calloused, sandpaper. He was careful not to hurt her. She could feel how soft she felt to him. She could feel herself through him, the way her body existed only where he touched her. The rest of her was smoke. She felt him shudder against her. Behind them the river pulsed through the darkness, shimmering like wild silk. Yellow bamboo wept. The scurrying, hurrying boat world was already gone. The white termites on their way to work, the white ladybirds on their way home, the white beetles burrowing away from the light, the white grasshoppers with white wood violins, the sad white music, all gone. Ammu crouched over Veluta, her mouth on his. He drew her hair round them like a tent. She slid further down, introducing herself to the rest of him. His neck, his nipples, his chocolate stomach. She sipped the last of the river from the hollow of his navel. She pressed the heat of his erection against her eyelids. She tasted him, salty in her mouth. He sat up and threw her back to him. She felt his belly tighten under her, hard as a board. She felt her wetness slipping on his skin. Clouded eyes held clouded eyes in a steady gaze, and a luminous woman opened herself to a luminous man. She was as wide and deep as a river in spate. He sailed on her waters. She could feel him moving deeper and deeper into her, frantic, frenzied, asking to be let in further. She lay against him, their bodies slick with sweat. She felt his body drop away from her. His breath becomes more regular. She saw his eyes clear. He stroked her hair, sensing that the knot that had eased in him was still tight and quivering in her. Gently, he turned her over on her back. He wiped the sweat and grit from her with his wet cloth. He kissed her eyes, her ears, her breasts, her belly, her 7 silver stretch marks from her twins. He held her against him, resting his back against the mangosteen tree, while she cried and laughed at once. Then, for what seemed like an eternity, she slept leaning against him, her back against his chest. 7 years of oblivion lifted off her and flew into the shadows on weighty, quaking wings. Like a dull steel peahen. When she was ready, she squatted facing him. She touched him lightly with her fingers and left a trail of goosebumps on his skin, like flat chalk on a blackboard, like breeze in a paddy field, like jet streaks in a blue church sky. He took her face in his hands and drew it towards his. He closed his eyes and smelled her skin. Amu laughed. She kissed his closed eyes and stood up. Velita, with his back against the mangosteen tree, watched her walk away. She had a dry rose in her hair. She turned to say it once again. Nale, tomorrow.